outdoor painted sculpture is everywhere. It's in cities, small and large, all the way up or down to private collections. Big institutions also will have wonderful sculpture gardens. It's fairly obvious that the sort of conditions that outdoor painted sculpture is exposed to are very extreme. They're very, very different from the beautifully controlled environment of a museum setting or an institutional setting where temperature, humidity, light levels are controlled perfectly often. Outdoor painted sculpture will be exposed to a lot of ultraviolet radiation, in addition to really very, very high light levels, which can be just as damaging. All of these conditions can have a very destructive effect on the paint surface. One of the sort of more usual approaches to conservation is the complete repaint. That would involve the complete removal of original paint layers and reapplying of new paint. When a piece is repainted as part of a conservation treatment, there are essentially two reasons for that. The first being very aesthetic. No one really wants to see faded, flaky, painted sculpture. But the other is a very sort of technical aspect of protection. As soon as you get cracks or flakes or defects in the paint layer, the deterioration of the metal can occur quite quickly.
The corrosion is the worst thing you can deal with. So if the paint is failing but the surface hasn't started corroding, you have a much easier time. You have a shot at treating locally. Once you have corrosion of any widespread sort, then you have to really bring the sculpture down to bare metal and start from scratch. The first and most challenging thing is to get the right color and reflectance. It was very interesting for me, that whole process of working on the mermaid in Miami Beach, the idea that it had been, over the course of years, repainted other colors because they couldn't match the color. In the best case scenario, you have a color sample that you can actually see and match to and give it to a paint company. In the case of the Lichtenstein mermaid, the only way we were able to match the original blue was by calling the Getty and getting Tom Lerner from the GCI and Julie Wolfe from the museum to send us the original blue color sample card that they had.
The whole process of repainting outdoor painted sculpture as part of a conservation treatment, it poses a number of, well, practical and ethical issues, dilemmas. On the ethical side, the guiding principle tends to be this very, very strong voice of the artist's intent. And typically it's a very, very strong opinion that these pieces just do not function if they don't look as they're supposed to. When the GCI started to focus a little bit more on this subject, it became quite clear that there were very, very few protocols in place for standardization of paint systems. As part of the GCI's Modern Contemporary Art Research Initiative, we started looking at outdoor painted sculpture in particular, largely because we'd done a lot of work on modern paints. When you come to outdoor sculpture, the range of materials in use dramatically expands. There's a whole new range of other polymers and pigments being used. The other reason for starting this particular area of work looking at outdoor painted sculpture was because the Getty Museum has a number of examples of painted sculpture in its collection. One of the pieces of outdoor painted sculpture in the collection is Roy Lichtenstein's 3 Brushstrokes. It was undergoing a fairly major conservation treatment by the museum, and it was a wonderful opportunity for us to really understand the thought processes that went on behind the scenes in terms of conservation practice.
Well, when we acquired Lichtenstein's 3 Brushstrokes in 2005, we knew right away that there were going to be some conservation issues, and we could see them on the surface. There was some evidence of paint failure areas where we could tell the paint was failing and the metal beneath was starting to corrode and causing pustuling. And we also, in contact with the Roy Lichtenstein Foundation, learned that the colors on the sculpture, in particular the red and the yellow and the blue, were not correct. In the 90s, it was repainted in a way that's not really accurate to the original surface. So we did decide in the end to do a full restoration.
Certainly the sort of starting point of the project for us was to look at analysis, how you actually identify the different paint systems that are being used in outdoor painted sculpture. You don't just take a paint sample and run it through a machine and you're told, in beautiful English, what the paint system is. It's a very long-term system of trying out different analytical techniques, trying to match certain peaks with certain products. Alan Phoenix, who does a lot of work with cross-sectional analysis in particular, was able to get some beautiful cross-sections where we could perfectly identify the later paint system and all the way down to the original paint system.
The unreliability of colour initially crossing, of how warm.
Working with the Getty Conservation Institute, the scientists were able to take samples of the paint. Using cross-sectional analysis, not only were the scientists able to identify all of the different layers, which is very helpful to know, it also was able to indicate just the condition of the layers. When the sculpture came in the lab for examination, we actually did some excavations of those paint layers on a larger scale, and were able to then compare what we were finding on the sculpture with the cross-sectional analysis. We wanted to use the sculpture as a model for how to replicate an original paint surface. And we were fortunate to be able to work with the Roy Lichtenstein estate. Roy's assistant, James De Pasquale, is still working for the estate and was willing to come to the Getty and do the final painting with us. Part of the goal of the treatment was to recreate the original surface as accurately as possible. And some of the materials that was used in Roy's studio in 1984 are no longer available. So I had to find modern equivalents.
Well, here at the Getty, we wanted the brushstroke look, so that was a priority. We wanted it to look brushed on, and the colors had to be correct. I think those are the two main things that concern me.
I think that this project will help the field in two ways, actually. The one is a very kind of practical example of how a procedure can be implemented, how we might help conservators understand what paints are, how they look now and in the future. The other part of this is just advancing this ethical debate about intention versus materiality that we cannot possibly hope to be stating this is the answer. But I think everybody in the field feels that the discussion has to continue, and I do think that outdoor painted sculpture brings up a number of these issues, that it's a nice subject to focus on and have that debate.